Welcome. My name is Maurice Turner. I'm a cybersecurity fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, United States. You're here with this esteemed panel to talk about making cyberspace safe for democracy. An open, free, secure, and resilient cyberspace is vital for democracy. It safeguards free institutions, open economies, and our way of life. But with the internet and ICT now being well-established features of modern life, malign actors use cyberspace to disrupt the democratic trust and infrastructure on which our societies depend. The availability of services can be disrupted to cripple government or election infrastructure. Online disinformation is used to influence citizens during elections or erode their confidence in political leaders. Data can be manipulated to forge false economic or political trends. And IT systems of political parties, businesses, or state institutions can be hacked to monitor internal communication or leak sensitive information to the public. The challenge will be for democracies to use technology more smartly than the people and states who want to turn it against our liberal societies. Such efforts are underway. In December 2020, the EU launched a new cybersecurity strategy aiming to promote global, open, stable, and secure cyberspace grounded in democratic values. And in the United States, President Biden and State Secretary Blinken have called to renew democracy in cyberspace. So please, join me in welcoming our panelists. Our first panelist, Ms. Nieke, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. The Cyber Policy Office is responsible for establishing Department of Defense cyberspace policy and strategy, providing guidance and oversight on DoD cyberspace activities, and managing DoD's primary external relationships across the United States government, key domestic stakeholders, and our allies and partners. Prior to that, she was the Senior Vice President for the National Security Program at the think tank Third Way, where she led their work on a wide range of national security issues, including foreign policy, Congress's role in the national security policymaking process, nonproliferation, intelligence oversight, electronic surveillance, and cybersecurity. She was the founder of the organization's Cyber Enforcement Initiative, which focused on improving the government's efforts to impose consequences on the human behind malicious cyber activity. Our next panelist, Catherine Fox. She leads the UK's Foreign Ministry to respond to and deter state-directed cyber attacks. This has included demonstrating it's possible for governments to publicly attribute cyber attacks to states, championing sanctions, and forming international coalitions of countries willing and able. Since joining the diplomatic service, Catherine has worked on the UK's bilateral relationship with Russia, Pakistan, and Ethiopia, and on multilateral engagement relating to Central Africa with a particular focus on peacekeeping. Prior to this, Catherine worked at the Ministry of Justice on British constitutional reform. She is passionate about effective government policymaking and holds a master's in public administration. Next, Casper Clingy is Microsoft's Vice President for European Government Affairs, with responsibility for all of Microsoft's government affairs and public policy work across the continent. Prior to joining Microsoft, he most recently served as Denmark's and the world's first ambassador to the global tech industry. Previous posts include ambassador to Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and ASEAN, ambassador to the Republic of Cyprus, deputy head of NATO's provincial reconstruction team in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and head of mission at the EU's Civilian Crisis Management Planning Mission in Kosovo. He holds a master's in political science and is a 2009 Marshall Memorial Fellow. Mr. Scott Jones is the head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. The Cyber Center is the single unified source of expert advice, guidance, and services and support on cybersecurity for government, critical infrastructure owners and operations, the private sector, and the Canadian public. He began his career in the Communications Security Establishment in 1999 and has held various positions, including Assistant Deputy Minister of IT Security, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of Corporate Services and Chief Financial Officer, Director General of Cyber Defense, and a variety of positions of increasing responsibility across CSE, primarily in the signals intelligence and IT security domains. He previously worked at the Privy Council Office as a National Security Policy Advisor in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. He holds a Bachelor of Applied Sciences in Electronic Systems Engineering, a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, and a Master of Business Administration. As you can see, this is going to be a wonderful chat about cyberspace and how we can make sure that we are securing it for democracy. So let's start off with the first question. How do we preserve a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace fit for democracy?
So Maurice, why don't I start with that, because I think, as you can tell from the President and Secretary Blinken's comments, the US is very much interested in making sure that we do just that. And as we think about technology and we see that there is really a need to reinvigorate how democracies work together in cyberspace. And really what we're seeing is a rise of digital authoritarianism practiced by a lot of countries, exported by countries like China, where they use technology for not only population control and repression, and limitations on speech, but also to seek economic advantage. And I think that what the United States and other democracies need to offer is an alternative to that. That is the free, open, multi-stakeholder, secure internet that has been at the core of cyberspace since its founding. So I think that you see increasingly the United States talking about that, and then talking about how we deal with the malicious actors in cyberspace. In particular, a matter of concern for us is the increasing linkages between some nations and malicious cyber actors. And we see some countries taking advantage of criminal networks for malicious activity, harboring criminal actors, or even in some cases having state actors moonlight in engaging in criminal activity. We do not believe that this is how responsible nations act in cyberspace, and we do not believe that nations should condone that activity. And you see, as with the President's comments at the summit in Geneva, taking a very strong stance against that kind of behavior.
And Catherine, how would you frame this issue?
So I think I'd start off by saying that we shouldn't let the fact that activity is happening in cyberspace confuse us, because our values are still our values, whether it's happening offline, whether it's happening online. So I think I'd want to draw on my experience of responding to threats in cyberspace, and particularly highlight the threats that we face in 4 key areas. I think there's so much discussion around, it focuses on cyber warfare a lot, and I think we can be in danger of missing what's happening day to day. So for me, the key issues are the ongoing pattern of behavior that's designed not to trigger governments to respond, or to make it difficult for governments to respond. We're not seeing direct interference in elections, but more hack and leaks, ongoing noisy, systematic targeting of key components of democracy, so political parties, parliaments. We're seeing essential services attacked by ransomware, particularly local authorities, schools, hospitals, and this is happening, I think, in most countries around the world. And we're seeing the impact of cyber-enabled commercial espionage, and in responding, we're facing not a choice between security and prosperity, but a choice between short-term economic interests and long-term economic interests. The UK government's been systematic in calling out irresponsible behaviour to help establish what's acceptable and what's not. So those responsible can no longer hide in the shadows. So I think there is a role in using technology smartly, as you said in your introduction, but I'd also want to make the case during this session for good old-fashioned diplomacy. Governments asking ourselves, when we understand the pattern of the threat, what are we going to do about it? So not just understanding and talking about the problem, using all the capabilities of government available to us to respond, including those classic diplomatic tools like private dialogue, démarches, political statements, travel bans, asset freezes, and acting in solidarity and acting internationally as default. Cyber attacks don't respect our international borders, so our response shouldn't either.
And Scott, what is the Canadian Cyber Centre's strategy for making cyberspace safe for democracy in Canada?
Well, thanks for that. There's quite a few pieces. The first piece really is about being transparent about what we're facing. And in 2017, we published the Cyber Threats to Canada's Democratic Processes. It is open, It is the only version of the report, and it was made public. And that was to say, these are the things we're facing. We updated that in 2019, and we will be updating that again. And that's, first of all, just to lay the foundation. This is what we need to be prepared for and what we need to be facing. The second piece is working with our institutions about resiliency. We certainly support our efforts from our diplomatic side in terms of the attribution, the technical aspects that are required for an attribution. But our part is also to increase resilience. So work with Elections Canada to strengthen their resiliency, their strength against any sort of malicious cyber activity, to maintain that confidence in the election. It's all about trust with citizens. But we also work with political parties. We give advice to candidates, and we provide, during the last election, we provided a place for them to call when there was a cyber incident, so they could turn to an expert to help them. And that was regardless of the party that happened to be the governing party versus all the other parties running. The offer was made to everybody. And that's just a few examples of where to build that resiliency, because at the long term, an incident starts to drain long-term confidence as these things build up over time. So how can we work to prevent the incidents, to keep that confidence in the democratic processes running? And then, of course, the last one, and probably the most difficult to tackle in our democracy, is around disinformation, malinformation, misinformation, and disinformation. Sometimes people just get their facts wrong. And how do you deal with that? That's a much harder problem to solve. And that's one where I think we need to start talking about what responsibility do platforms have in harboring this, in fostering this, especially when it's with ill intent and it is somebody who's out there to disrupt the democratic process. But really, we're working on the resiliency pieces and making people aware and helping them to respond if something bad does happen as quickly as possible, so that we can get back to what we need to talk about, the things that we want to talk about in our democracy, not people's attempts to interfere in it.
Casper, you've had a unique combination of experiences both in the public sector and in the private sector. I'm interested to hear, what has that combination of experiences taught you about how we can best defend cyberspace?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, thanks a lot. And you mentioned that I'm a Marshall Memorial Fellow, although it's a few years ago, so it's a particular pleasure for me to join a GMF panel, and it's great to be with the other panelists. If you allow me, Morris, just to say a couple of words on why I think it is a particularly relevant discussion we have right now of bringing sort of cyberspace, cybersecurity together with democracy. And it's really about looking at where the world is right now. And I guess I'm the only one sort of sitting physically inside the European Union, so I'll say a few words on how it looks from a European point of view. And I think if we had this discussion 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, we would still have doubled down on the importance of creating a safe cyberspace with clear rules, with trust, etc. But I think when we're looking at the world right now, at hopefully the end of the pandemic, looking at how important the digital tools have been during COVID-19, and making sure that we preserved as many jobs as possible, that the economies didn't contract more than necessary. I'm not saying it hasn't been difficult, but I think that because of the availability of digital technologies of the 21st century, I think we've been able to come through the crisis better than we would otherwise have been. But the fundamental side of the digital economy, and I think we can all throw some numbers at how important and how much the digital economy is going to develop over the next couple of years and the next decade. The problem is that cyber attacks, misinformation, interference with election processes, it takes away the foundational aspect of that, and that is trust in technology. And I think when we speak to friends or family members and talk a little bit about the trust in digital tools, I think unfortunately, that is being threatened, or at least being impacted by the perception that we're not operating necessarily safe. And when you then look back at a global pandemic where you actually had some of the perpetrators attacking, critical infrastructure, even our healthcare authorities in the middle of a very, very difficult global crisis, I think that adds to the lack of confidence in the digital tools that, frankly speaking, is going to be so important moving forward, both for governments, for the private sector, for civil society, etc. So I think, it's not rocket science. I think one of the most important things why it is that we need to find a common way forward, and why I think building alliances among different actors that adhere to a similar set of democratic values is more important than ever. And then it will come as a shocking surprise to you that, when I do represent a private company here, that one of the aspects we're promoting is, of course, to look at the cyberspace area in terms of multi-stakeholderism, we think it is critically important that we also bring the private sector into the discussions, because we are in many ways the first responders when it comes to the cyber attacks that we're facing in today's world. So I think looking at the other panelists, it's really a good combination of people from different geographies, from different backgrounds. And I think that's exactly what we need to do if we want to make sure that we build a safer, more trustworthy cyberspace moving ahead.
Thank you. So much of our discussions about making cyberspace safe have revolved around the adversaries. Who are the folks that are launching attacks, or at least harboring those criminals that are launching attacks? Russia tends to come up a lot. China tends to come up a lot. But I'd like to hear from you all. What do you perceive as the greatest threat to cyberspace that's not receiving enough attention?
So Maurice, on that, I think that what we've seen is an increase in capability of the non-state actors, the criminal actors that are harbored by and their ecosystems are nurtured by various nation states, whether that is harboring people who are conducting ransomware or taking advantage of those criminal networks for access and to cover up their malicious activity. While at one point, I think we saw the nation states as the most capable, the availability of tools to those non-state actors has resulted in significant disruption, I think, to many countries around the world, including the United States, as we saw so clearly with the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline. It's not just the criminal acts themselves, but the collateral impact that can cause tremendous damage to civilian populations. So I think that that's one of those things that until recently had not gotten sufficient attention from nations, was the rise of these non-state actors. And we are all coming together to recognize and address that threat. And you saw the president again addressing that directly with President Putin in Geneva to say, do not harbor these people, and we don't accept that kind of behavior. Making very clear that the United States thinks that there should be consequences for that kind of thing. We need to be able to identify those individual actors, to be able to impose accountability on them, and not just ignore the threat because it hasn't risen to the level of armed conflict.
Yeah, if maybe I could just build off of that. I think absolutely. Like I couldn't agree more with the like the rise of ransomware as a service, cybercrime as an enterprise. And all of the things that support that, whether it be anonymous cryptocurrencies, and then or states harboring and allowing this activity to flourish. But I think we also need to look at, if we look at threat equals motivation plus opportunity plus capability, it's very difficult. We have to do motivation as a whole different geostrategic calculus, and it's not going to be technical countermeasures. But we can do a lot to reduce our opportunity, and that's something that we're not paying enough attention to. The technology industry, with all respect to the industry itself, is not rewarded for security. They're rewarded for first to market, quick feature deployment, we ship it and fix it. There are some companies that are very much trying to buck that trend, but that's not what they're typically rewarded for in the market. That's not what they're rewarded for in quarterly profits. And that's something that we're going to have to address. If we're going to address the fundamental confidence in technology, somehow we have to reverse that course. So we've seen some very public executive orders from my friends in the US, which have been a great step forward in some of these things around critical infrastructure. But at the end of the day, we can't change the motivation of our adversaries. We can't change, they will pay money, they will work to develop capabilities. And in cybercrime case, you can buy them on the dark web. I mean, you can just rent them for when you need them. But we can change their opportunity. We have some control over that, and we can make ourselves harder targets. We can make ourselves more resilient and more able to better respond. And that's the place where we have to figure out how to do that as democratic nations. And there are a lot of incentives right now in the technology industry that don't align for this. In the context of a democracy, we've made some explicit choices in our elections administrator to stick with a paper ballot, et cetera, that gets counted. And we have procedures in place to minimize the online risk. Not that we don't like technology and we're not embracing it, but we're doing it very carefully because at the end of the day, we want confidence in that vote.
Maurice, perhaps I could give a slightly different perspective, sort of focusing in on in your question about the areas not receiving much attention. I suspect all of us on this panel have been speaking about ransomware for quite some time, and it's perhaps a good moment for us that it feels like people are beginning to understand, and we definitely should be holding states like Russia to account for what's happening on their territory. They have a responsibility to act, and international partners have a role in putting political pressure on them to act. But I think that overall, I would say what's not receiving enough attention is looking at that pattern of activity. In particular, cyber-enabled commercial espionage. I often describe it as sort of cyber attack that nobody's heard of. And back in December 2018, the UK was one of, I think, about 14 countries around the world who called out China for one of the most significant and widespread cyber intrusions uncovered to date, targeting commercial secrets and economies around the world. And as we said at the time, this is still ongoing. I think it's really important we continue to work with international partners, and we should be continuing to work out how we respond to that. That pattern hasn't changed. And I also think we're improving in how we respond to history repeating itself. And again, to talk about the areas I've been personally involved in, when international partners called out Russia's GRU in February 2020 for a cyber attack on Georgia, I think what was really significant here was we were doing at the beginning of what looked like a pattern emerging. A pattern emerging we've seen happening in Ukraine in 2015 to 2017, and we're able to do that right at the beginning. So we could ensure that Georgia's sovereignty wasn't impinged anymore, there wasn't any more disabling action. So I think it's seeing it through that lens of a pattern is quite helpful in identifying what we should be responding to.
Catherine, I think you bring up a great point that being able to securely communicate is a key tenet of not only democracies, but of functioning governments and also functioning economies. And something that has been discussed thoroughly is the idea of end-to-end encryption and whether or not government actors should be able to have extraordinary access to those communications. Do you think we can still secure that right to communicate with individual parties, using end-to-end encryption, or is that something where we need to give up a little bit of freedom of speech there in order to make sure that malicious actors can be tracked down effectively? We've seen this to great effect just this past week, where there was a multi-stakeholder investigation bringing down a criminal ring because the FBI and other countries had access to the Anom app and the communications that were happening among those criminal parties.
Maurice, maybe just from the Defense Department's perspective, I think that we have tremendous concerns about how a lawful access mandate would be implemented on the private sector, in ways in which that, whether or not that mandate would be secure. The Department of Defense has significant sensitive communications that we are trying to protect. And we rely on that commercial technology for our communications. We worry very much about its vulnerability to espionage. So any lawful access mandate in the United States, we would have to weigh very carefully about exactly how that would be implemented to ensure that we would have security and confidence in our own communications. We think that this represents a serious national security concern for the department.
And if I can just build off that, I couldn't agree with that more. I think one of the things we need to think about is what problems are we trying to solve? And if we look at the online harms conversation, is the solution about encryption, or is the solution about creating a safer environment that prevents those online harms from even being able to occur? And so I think we need to break it down in a lot more basic fashion, because at the end of the day, in my job is to make sure that we are using good cryptography to protect both sensitive government communications, but also to allow our online environment to thrive. And so anything that is about weakening or lessening encryption from a cybersecurity point of view is frankly dangerous. But that doesn't mean there's not a really legitimate conversation to be had, but it shouldn't be applied as a blunt instrument. This isn't encryption versus the other things. It needs to be talked about in terms of the scenarios, because at the end of the day, I need that strong encryption so that we know that the updates that are being sent are at least coming from the provider that we expect them to come from. Then, then we can talk about all the other supply chain issues we need to talk about. But the encryption, frankly, it is the only piece of security on the internet. Otherwise, everything else is just hope.
The threats and risks being online seem to be increasing with each passing day. So who are some of those adversaries that are in our online environment and becoming threatening actors, and what can be done to stop them?
Well, maybe I'll start, since this is kind of my day-to-day business, but I'll try to leave lots of room. So we issue our National Cyber Threat Assessment. We just did that a few months back. And it boils down to pretty much anybody who wants to do something malicious online can do it. The environment is there. The opportunities I talked about is there. Cyber criminals are the ones that we say are the biggest threat for the most widespread, but we actually named some states in our report who are their most prolific actors. But let's be really frank here. You can buy extremely sophisticated cyber espionage tools. They're not that far away from cyber crime tools. They're available on the dark web, and they're companies for hire. So if you want a cyber program, you can build one. You can build one with just enough money, and it's not a substantial amount anymore. Which means we now have to talk about the other side of the equation, which is we are on the cusp of a renaissance of defense. Because frankly, what drove our program to innovate in the early 2010s was desperation about the level of activity we were seeing in the government of Canada. And so we innovated while we're seeing the same level of desperation in the private sector now. But it's every actor. It's states, whether it's for commercial espionage, whether it's intimidation, whether it's pre-positioning for disruption and disruptive capabilities. We talk about that in our National Cyber Threat Assessment. Criminals, financial gain, one way or another, or to gain enough information to use in a future activity. But all of that has value. Those are predominantly. Then you still have hacktivists, thrill seekers. You still have people who are online protest, etc. Their tools are getting a little bit more dealt with. We don't see as much of those activities. They're still there, but it really is those cybercrime groups that are operating out of foreign countries that are harboring them. And then, of course, the same states that we've always seen.
Maurice, I think that Scott provided an excellent overview of the threats that are out there. I would just note that the United States recently produced an intelligence report on those threat actors that have been specifically focused on undermining confidence in our democracy. And while I think people have spoken a lot about the Russians, it's lesser known that in fact, the Iranians have also been very aggressive in cyberspace, putting out misinformation, trying to drive additional division within our system, including threats against election officials. So I think that it's important to recognize that those states that are trying to undermine sovereignty decisions in other nations are creating a very destabilizing environment. The United States is still wrestling with the consequences of that misinformation, even to this day, as people are boosting divisive narratives, putting out false information about the integrity of the elections. And the Department of Defense stands ready to defend the next midterm elections. But this is a mission in defending the nation that the department has had to take on, and we will continue to do so. It is one of those ways in which our commitment to democracy is increasingly tested.
The answers so far have focused quite a lot on defense, and that's really important. But I think where cyberspace can be a little bit different to other domains is when you're trying to stop actors or use the language of deterrence. There is a role that some cyber attacks are always going to get through. So I would make the case for, well, defense is the primary defense. There's also a role in ensuring that there are costs and seen to be in costs, that we change the incentives for whether I think for a long while, cyber attacks were seen as sort of cheap, relatively easy, cost-free way of approaching it. So I think there is a role for governments in acting in coordination internationally to hold those responsible for account. So we applying costs at a political level, as well as imposing costs on those individuals making it less attractive option for them to go into that, and organizations. So this isn't the tool they're automatically reaching for, because they think it's the easy way to achieve strategic advantage. And in doing so, I think it's really important that we do take a diplomatic perspective, that we're designing campaigns. This isn't just about sitting there waiting for a cyber attack to happen and then sort of deciding which tool to pull out of the box to use. That we are building international coordination into everything, even seemingly bilateral action. And that we are considering the full range of tools. This isn't just responding to cyber with cyber. There are many tools governments can use, as they would in other domains, and ensuring that we're sustaining this action over time as well.
That's very important to note. I'm curious to hear more about how we can work together in the international community to further that development of norms and doctrines to help manage the escalation and even deterrence of future cyber operations.
Maurice, I think what Catherine just said about accountability for the actors is incredibly important. Norms are one thing, and it's very important that we come together around a series of principles, what we agree to. But in many ways, norms are only as good as their enforcement. So to the extent that we can work together to hold countries accountable for their counter-normative behavior, and we can do that through law enforcement action, through international cooperation, by standing together in joint attributions or in sanctions against states that persist in engaging in counter-normative behavior. There must be costs for this. It cannot just be words. And I think President Biden has been very clear in his interest in holding states accountable for their malicious activity. And I think that what we are seeing with the actions of the Department of Justice and the FBI in recent months is a renewed focus by our law enforcement agencies to be able to hold individuals accountable for their behavior, for their malicious behavior in cyberspace.
I think some of the ways we can improve that international coordination actually bring together, we're not just a panel of government representatives here, but industry as well, is actually in the information sharing side. In my experience of trying to work with other countries, it's the difficulty in us all understanding who was responsible and sharing that information. It isn't necessarily about sharing highly classified information. There is a huge amount in open source. Don't forget, cyber attacks happen on the internet, so they leave evidence there for everyone to see. And there's a huge amount of information being produced by industry, by civil society, academics looking at the impact of what we're doing. And I often think that working out who's responsible is a bit like doing a jigsaw. But in this case, we're doing a 1,000-piece jigsaw, and it's probably a picture of the sky with clouds, so something really quite difficult. And we need to stop sort of requiring each actor in this space to try and do that jigsaw themselves, but see it much more as a collaborative jigsaw. So I'd use this opportunity to really encourage everyone who's got part of one or two more pieces of the jigsaw to be sharing that in order to help us to be responding internationally.
I'd like to hear from Casper with respect to, what are these capabilities that that individual users should have compared to local, state, and other law enforcement agencies? Since you at Microsoft have direct access to all of those levels of capabilities, what goes behind the decision making on just which tools to put into hands of which users?
Yeah, but Maurice, perhaps before doing that, I mean, it's always good when you have a little bit of disagreement on a panel. So I thought I would take a stab at Scott and something he said a little bit earlier today. My apologies, Scott. But, I think you said something along the lines that the private sector is not necessarily rewarded for upgrading the security aspects of it. And I don't think we disagree at the end of the day, but I would just, at least for polemic reasons, disagree a little bit, because I do actually think that in the private sector, certainly for a company like Microsoft, it is absolutely essential for the trust that our customers have in our products, that we do everything we can to protect our customers, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, from cyber attacks, no matter whether they come from state actors or non-state actors. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why, when we look at what we can do, just going back to your previous question, Maurice, one of the things that is different today than perhaps with some of the threats we've seen globally in the past couple of decades is that we really need to have the private sector work much closer together with the public sector. Just a small example, in Microsoft, we have more than 3,000 people that are working 24/7, every single day, just to focus on cybersecurity aspects, to mitigate, the thousands of attacks that come in on our systems every single day. I think it's a good example of the fact that we are frontline, responders, and in many ways the first responders to the cyber attacks that we see today, whether they're ransomware, whether they are more sophisticated, complex attacks like the one we've seen in the last couple of months. The other thing I would just say, which I think is a bit of a game changer that perhaps doesn't always get as much attention as it should, is the regulatory front. Because again, when you look at it from at least a European Union point of view, that is what I'm looking at. We've really seen over the last couple of years an increased focus on advancing cybersecurity also from a regulatory point of view, which means that we now have both national laws, we also have EU-wide regulations that are upgrading the capabilities of mitigating the threats from cybersecurity. And it might sound like a very boring and not particularly sexy aspect of the cybersecurity discussion, but I think it's a game changer in the fact we now have thresholds or minimum standards that will actually make it more difficult for the perpetrators to do what they do. And then I think it is important, just going back to what Nieke and Catherine said before, I think the norms discussion is incredibly important. In Microsoft, we are supporting that, whether it's in the UN track or also multi-stakeholder forums like the Paris call at the Paris Peace Forum. We want to contribute to that because we think having traffic rules in cyberspace is actually also essential for the private sector to, be prosperous and to make sure that we have state-of-the-art technology being out and about. But I think it is also important to say that there is a very important technical side of this, which is again where the private sector comes in. We have to innovate, we have to invest in security. Unfortunately, there is an arms race out here, and when we look at Hafnium or SolarWinds in the last couple of months, those were very complex and sophisticated attacks. Unfortunately, most of them on-premise systems. So I think one of the aspects of also defending ourselves in the best possible way is actually to look at cloud computing as a better way of ensuring and increasing our security. But fundamentally, just going back to what I said before, we actually welcome regulation in this area because it would help both our customers, the public sector, to do more, and at a time where this is absolutely essential.
It's critically
if I could just
important
jump in there, because actually I think Casper, you and I both agree here. My issue isn't like, we absolutely have had a great security relationship with companies, and Microsoft's a great example of a company that invests. My point is that security features, how the product's built, et cetera, needs to be part of the feature set during procurement, but also the market isn't rewarding companies who are investing in things like long-term security. They reward companies that are looking for short-term quarterly profitability, which is a counter. And that's what we've seen in some of these incidents as well, where decisions to increase profitability over the short term to get the bonus have resulted in long-term security consequences. And so your point about regulation, et cetera, and there are companies that are bucking that trend. There's absolutely examples of that, but I think it's because the companies are seeing a long-term value proposition here. But how do we create that to be the norm in the industry rather than the exception for some companies who are willing to invest because they play the long game? So I think we actually agree here.
Well, it's critically important to bring together international partners to help develop these norms and help harmonize regulation, because we're talking about entities that are working across borders. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that some of these international partners or players are not willing to come to the table and coordinate and be cooperative. And so what they're doing is they're actually splintering off their own version of their internet so they can establish their own rules. But that threatens this entire idea of interoperability of not only communication platforms, but also economies as well. Is this something that we can reverse, or is this an inevitable trend that we're going to have these splintered internets globally?
Maurice, I think this is a real challenge, and I think is a challenge that we will see in this contest between competing visions of the internet for some time to come. I think what's very clear for those democratic nations is that we cannot just say no to the technology alternatives proposed by those who are advancing an authoritarian model, but we have to propose technology alternatives. And that's where we have to work with the private sector to make sure that we can compete not only on values, but also on technology. And that's something that you see this administration investing in, thinking about how do we renew our commitment to that technology, to that vision of an open, free, interoperable, secure internet that is vibrant and provides a place, for multi-stakeholder governance, as opposed to a top-down information controlled environment that can be misused against those who would dissent or speak in ways that the leadership might not approve of, or enables a surveillance regime. That kind of environment is pervasive and is contrary to the values of democratic societies that value freedom of speech and dissent, that for which holding our leadership accountable is an essential part of our governance structure, and questioning our government is an essential part of our governance structure. This needs to be an approach that we all engage in. Over the long haul, we believe that this is the more beneficial approach for society and for all people, so that they can have a stake in the future of their own lives. And so you will see this administration continuing to invest in the development of that technology and also to speak out against the challenges of digital authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think there are two different ways to look at the splintering. Not that that's the only two, but one is an economic argument where you're trying to use the ecosystems that are out there. You still ride on the standard internet, but you're using the ecosystems, and it's to drive economic growth and economic value to stay either in your region, in your country. And so it's a completely competing ecosystem, but it rides on the same technology base. And then there's the new IP standards and things like that that are being put forward, which are to enable more state control, state surveillance, and censorship. And those are the changes to the foundational protocols of the internet itself. And those are things that are being proposed, like, Russia, China are both advancing that cause. And those are even more concerns, because there is a legitimate cybersecurity argument, but it goes contrary to all of the values that have just been mentioned here. And so I really think there's two pieces. One is a lot of the economic value being generated is driving into a few big multinational companies. And there are countries that are saying, well, wait a minute, I want some of that. And that's driving one set of splintering, and that's an ecosystem splintering. The other one is this fundamental difference in approach to what the internet should be. And it's basically open, free versus state controlled, state censorship dominate the domination of the nation.
Catherine, do you think that there's room to be able to balance these differing viewpoints regarding cyberspace and even cybersecurity, like Scott mentioned?
Thanks, Maurice. I realize you're probably going to call time on the discussion fairly soon as it's ticking away. So if it's okay, I might offer a final remark. Just listening to this discussion and aware overall of the very different perspectives we come from, I often think, perhaps I feel it most as a diplomat who goes into quite a technical space. I perhaps notice my different point of view as I bring in diplomatic tools with me. But it really reinforces for me the importance of bringing all these different perspectives together. No one tool is going to do this, and perhaps it's an illustration of our democratic approaches in practice, bringing those values with us. But our conversation today has really reminded me the importance of taking all those different approaches. There's no one right answer here. There's no one thing we can do.
Excellent, thank you. And apologies, the time did get away from us, but I guess that means that we were involved in an interesting discussion, and obviously the discussion will continue. So I'd like to go ahead and thank all of you for your participation in this discussion. I hope that you all learned a lot from each other, and I hope that those in the audience learn from the panelists as well. Please continue to follow the discussion in the future, and I appreciate your time today. And I'd like to say thank you again. And with this, we'll conclude the panel.